All right, now it's time to make fun of Ethan Klein.
Devolves into disaster.
Socialism is bad because socialism is tyranny.
What have I ever done except get hundreds of millions of people killed?
The whole point of that video was to refute the idea that socialism always leads to disaster and tyranny. I also went on to show how capitalism, due to its very design with its constant need for profits and expansion at the expense of human well-being, has led to dictatorship and catastrophe many, many times. So in this video, I want to do two things that I didn't have time for in the last one. One, talk a little more about past socialist projects that have a bad reputation among certain crowds like the USSR, China, and so on, and add a bit more context as to why some autocratic and undesirable deficiencies emerged in them, and two, go over some of the many socialist projects that didn't turn into what Mr. H3 could call a disaster. Unless,
by the way, if you think China's a disaster, then the word disaster means nothing. If you're talking about people that starved in the Great Leap Forward, there was a non-stop cycle of Chinese famines for 1,000 fucking years that killed far more people than died under Mao. It was the Chinese Communist Party that ended the cycle of famine. Like, you could just look at list of famines in China. Look at this. 6 million dead in the 1333 famine. 2 million dead in the Chunzhen drought, leading to the collapse of the Ming Dynasty. 11 million died in the 1810 flood. 45 million population decrease in the 1846 famine, with 15 million dead. 8 million died in the 1857 famine. 30 million people died in the 1851 to 1873 famine. The northern Chinese famine of 1876 killed 13 million. 25 million died in the Chinese famine of 1906 to 1907 under capitalism. 10 million died in the Chinese famine of 1929. I'm sorry, 1928 to 1930. That was another 10 million under capitalism. 5 million died in the the famine of 1936. And like the Great Chinese Famine, the Great Leap Forward, they say 15 million died. Look how many more died in the Chinese famine of 1906. 55 million by the way is not true. But guess what? There's no more. Wow, look at all these famines, and then the Chinese Communist Party develops the country and there's no more. They had a bad famine. Floods, droughts, typhoons, and an insect invasion. Oh, that means communism is invalid, guys. Oh wait, there's no more. Weird. There was plenty of modern technology in 1930 when 10 million died, but that was under capitalism, so that doesn't count.
Tsarist Russia was a countries like. When you hear the term to do with socialism and a lot more to do with protecting capital and Western business interests. So let's do that now. When you hear the term socialism, I doubt you immediately think of the definition, social ownership of the means of production, and what exactly that even means. Your mind probably just instinctively jumps to countries like Cuba, the USSR, China, and so forth. Now, the debate, even amongst leftists, on whether or not some of these countries constitute socialism rages on. We won't entertain that right now, but what we can say for certain is that all of these countries prior to their revolutions were much worse off. In Cuba, the US-backed right-wing dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista prioritized American business interests as his regime was responsible for wicked human rights abuses in the form of mass murders and torture. Tsarist Russia was a semi-feudal backwater filled with misery and destitution, and same goes for China. I'll let Dr. Parenti give you a glimpse into the state of China prior to the rise of the Communist Party.
When the communists liberated Shanghai from the US-sponsored Kuomintang reactionary government in 1949, the communists found that about 20% of the population in Shanghai, 1.2 million people, were drug addicts. And every morning, special crews of street cleaners, quote, would gather up the corpses of children and adults who had been murdered during the night or died of disease, cold, and starvation.
Disaster, Ethan, is what these countries had prior to socialism. After each country had its revolution, the usage of the land, labor, and capital was reorganized in a way to suit the interests of the vast majority of the people, and not just a small elite. This doesn't mean that these societies shouldn't be criticized. They were far from perfect, and if you're familiar with my channel, you would know that I criticize them a lot, and I urge people not to glorify the more autocratic deficiencies that later emerged in them. But I also urge people to look at the entire picture and try to understand what happened instead of just brushing them off as either good or bad, as if forcing a country into that sort of reductive moral binary and then refusing to explore any further is productive in any way. There is a conversation to be had about how some of these societies went on to take a more authoritarian form. I personally am not a fan of hyper-centralized authority for prolonged periods of time because I think it could lead to some undesirable outcomes, but we need to examine why some of these socialist projects felt the need to centralize authority in such a way to begin with. In every socialist society, the one thing that was a constant, the thing they could all assure would be soon to greet them if their revolutions were successful, was attack and animosity from capitalist nations. This took the form of invasions, bombing, embargoes, sanctions, assassination attempts, and more. This constant bombardment from external threats breeds paranoia and autocracy. It causes power to centralize, dissent to be taken much more seriously, and sometimes viewed as an existential threat. This leads to unideal outcomes. But I have a hard time seeing how this has anything to do with socialism as a theory. It seems to be the result of being under constant attack. If we look at Russia post-revolution, when a multitude of Western nations invaded the country and sided with the White Army to fight against the communists in the Russian Civil War, we can start to understand why paranoia was rampant in the USSR right from the jump. If we shift our focus over to different kinds of socialist experiments, ones that are often referred to as democratic socialist projects where leaders and parties rose to power through peaceful and electoral means while maintaining a free and open press as well as encouraging opposing political parties, which is what I advocate for, by the way. We can see how quickly they were infiltrated by the capitalist powers of the world, specifically the US. From Allende in Chile to Arbenz in Guatemala, both men were democratically elected, and it didn't take long for the US to spend millions of dollars infiltrating their media, supporting reactionary elements within their militaries, and ultimately overthrowing them both. We now begin to understand the unfortunate and undesirable decisions made by the likes of...
Yeah, see, if a left-wing government is strong enough to resist the United States, it's authoritarian. And if the United States overthrows your government, well, I guess democracy isn't that important after all. And they'll have a military dictatorship where they kill all the leftists to make sure they don't get in power again for a while.
Fidel Castro, when he decided that a free press, while being under attack by the US, would be a death wish. I don't even advocate for the specifics found in some of these past projects. I champion more of a bottom-up approach. But to paint these past societies as disasters without understanding what they were up against, what they replaced, and without mentioning the millions of lives that were improved because of them, is ahistorical. This leads me to the main point of this video. Why is it when the average apolitical person is confronted with the term socialism, they immediately think of states like the USSR and North Korea, but rarely Salvador Allende's Chile? And the reason for that is simple. The former, states like the USSR, came to power via revolution and were heavily propagandized for decades, partly due to
it's because the USSR actually represented a threat to the United States of America and was a challenge to global hegemony, right? Whereas Allende wasn't.
the fact that they survived the initial attack by capitalist forces. The latter, states like Chile, implemented socialism democratically and through electoral means. They weren't hyper-militant, the Americans overthrew them quickly, and there was no need for the US to spend decades filling our heads with Red Scare propaganda about them. Put simply, it's survivorship bias. We remember the countries that survived being attacked by the West, but as a result of them surviving the onslaught, paranoia and autocracy began to rear their ugly heads within those countries. It's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So with that out of the way, and to show Ethan the range and variety of past socialist experiments.
Well, the other thing is, like, they also recapitulate, they basically reframe previous socialist experiments that didn't achieve full socialism as if they were liberal, right? And MLs do this too, which is very stupid. And that's the main reason I don't identify as an ML. Like, for example, if a socialist party comes in and does, you know, co-determination and sectoral bargaining and high taxes on the wealth and, you know, highly redistributive social safety net and, you know, nationalized businesses and all this shit that is not full socialism where we've completely deleted the capitalist class. We haven't achieved a full proletarian dictatorship. MLs will be like, aha, that's just liberal capitalism. As opposed to saying like, wow, the states that run the best are the ones that had socialist governments that did a whole bunch of fucking redistribution in government capacity and state capacity. And then they didn't achieve all their final goals of transitioning out of capitalism. So now that just becomes recapitulated as liberalism. And it's like, no, that's not why that exists. The model does not, like, Norway isn't Norway because capitalists decided to be nice one day.
For the remainder of this video, we will quickly look at some socialist projects that improved the quality of life for the vast majority of people and did not turn into what he could consider a disaster. So let's do that. I put these examples of socialist projects in the honorable mentions category, not because they were unimpressive, but because I've already gone over them many times on this channel. So I want to quickly run through them for those
What do
who
I mean, recapitulated as liberalism? Like, basically you just go like, oh, see, I think I like the Nordic model, which is capitalism with a welfare state, right? And there is validity to that argument that it is capitalism with a robust welfare state, but that doesn't actually explain the political hows of why that exists. And I also don't think of the Nordic model as the end state, but I think as the Nordic model as superior to what we have, right? Like more desirable to live in the Nordic model than it is to live in American hypercapitalism, right? So if something is better objectively by measuring human flourishing, you go, okay, then we should implement that if we can. I'm not saying that's the final end state, but it's stupid to be like, free healthcare and free housing and cheap childcare and high taxes on the wealthy and expansive social welfare state and state-owned enterprise. That's not full communism. Therefore, it's liberalism. Is silly. Unless you already have that, in which case you're right. If you're sitting in those states, maintaining the status quo is liberalism. That would not be socialist. If you're a status quo person in Norway, you are not a left-winger. That's right. That's right. But if you are saying, hey, we should implement some of this shit that they already have over in Norway, in America, that makes you to the left of the status quo. Now, if we get that shit, if somehow we implemented a whole bunch of those programs that they have in Norway, and then you said, oh, that's job here is done, now I defend the status quo, then yes, you would be a liberal. And I think this is kind of the issue is people are very interested in a type of politics that doesn't seem relevant to what's going on. And I will say this. If America ever had like a revolutionary moment, right, where there's a revolution happening and people are trying to implement like full-blown socialism through revolution, I would be in favor of those people. If they were like a substantively like serious threat to the status quo, I would 100% be behind the revolutionaries, and I would abandon any of my like electoral or other, social democratic proposals instantly. The only reason why I support social democratic proposals as they are currently in the United States is because I don't see that revolutionary moment currently happening. But if that revolutionary moment did happen, then I would abandon any kind of like reformist or social democratic policy in favor of revolution. I'm just interacting with the world as it is now and trying to make improvements by any means necessary. And I think that's exactly how you should look at politics. But isn't that just sock dem stuff? Sock dems, I think Wikipedia explains it the best. So people like literally, I think at this point, just even having a level of understanding of social democracy that you get from Wikipedia is better than 99% of people talking about social democracy. Social democracy is a social, economic, and political philosophy within socialism that supports political and economic democracy and a gradualist, reformist, and democratic approach toward achieving social equality. AKA the Social Democrats. And by the way, in the past, social democracy stretched back to the 19th century labor movement, originally a catch-all term for socialists of varying tendencies. After the Russian Revolution, it came to refer to reformist socialists that were opposed to the authoritarian and centralized Soviet model of socialism. Now, personally, this is out of date. Who gives a shit? This is out of date. You're having conversations about political environment that doesn't exist anymore. Stop having these stupid fucking arguments anymore. The Soviet Union isn't there anymore.
May be new to my videos, starting with Salvador Allende of Chile. This topic in particular I've covered many times. If you want an in-depth video about Allende and the Chilean road to socialism, check out this video of mine. But to briefly recap, prior to Allende, much of Chile's industry and resources were owned by foreign corporations. From copper mines to the telecommunications industry, American businesses soaked up plenty of Chilean wealth, while many Chileans lived in poverty. This was and still is a common arrangement in many areas in the developing world. Rich Western corporations will buy up the natural resources, exploit the local labor forces, and if the people of the exploited nation decide to fight back, either through revolution or by electoralism, Western governments, acting in partnership with their business interests, will install a fascist dictator to protect their profits. This little arrangement tends to benefit two groups: the Western business interests, who siphon the wealth away from these poorer countries, and the local elite of these poorer countries, who make up a small percentage of the population and tend to benefit from their alliance with these Western capitalists. In 1970, Salvador Allende was legally and constitutionally elected, and he vowed to take back Chilean resources and industry to help develop the country and pull people out of poverty. He referred to his ambitions as the Chilean road to socialism, where he would bring about those ends by respecting the democratic and constitutional integrity of Chile. This immediately pissed off the Americans, who had spent years trying to convince people that socialism and democracy were mutually exclusive. By the end of Allende's first year, he had nationalized over 150 enterprises and loosened the Americans' grip over his country. He had an impressive first year and a half, and to back up that statement, I will use my favorite Marxist source, the CIA. Allende's economy saw an 8.5% jump in GDP, a lower rate of inflation compared to his predecessor, the lowest unemployment rate in a decade, a sharp boost in real wages for Chile's lower classes, leading to a consumer buying spree that boosted manufacturing output by 12%, and an additional 12% boost in construction activity, leading to a decline of the unemployment rate in the Santiago area from 8.3% to 3.8%. Now, to you and I, this seems like a good thing. People are enjoying rising living standards, and foreign exploitation is screeching to a halt, but for the Americans and the Chilean conservative elite, this was really bad news. The CIA began funding right-wing opposition in Chile. They gave over $1 million to El Mercurio, an anti-Allende conservative media outlet. Nixon gave the order to make the economy scream when referring to what he wanted done to Allende's Chile. The Chilean right-wing and business owners engaged in attempts to sabotage the economy by withholding their goods and refusing to sell them, which led to artificial scarcity. The US established an economic blockade. It used its influence to cut international and bilateral aid and private credit to Chile, prevented Allende from being able to renegotiate the national debt that he had inherited from his predecessor, and so much more. Long story short, the right-wing Chilean military, taking advantage of the US's work in destabilizing Allende, bombed the presidential palace and overthrew the government. Allende lost his life that day, and Chile fell to the dictatorial rule of Augusto Pinochet, who spent the coming decades torturing, murdering, kidnapping, and terrorizing Chileans while protecting American business interests in the country. So I guess in a roundabout way, this did lead to disaster, but not because of socialism, but because of the overthrow of socialism and the replacement of Allende with a tyrant who would protect U.S. business interests. In addition to Allende's Chile, Thomas Sankara's legacy in Burkina Faso is worth looking at as well. And yes, I apologize, this image is computer generated, very cringe of me, but there are just 0 public domain images of my guy Thomas, so I guess this is what we're gonna have to do. Burkina Faso was originally a French colony called Upper Volta. Like many other colonized lands, it suffered the usual burdens of colonialism and exploitation. It was severely destitute, prone to famines, the labor force was exploited by France, gender discrimination was rampant, and the overall quality of life was horrendous. We should all know by now that colonialism is a form of violence that breeds resistance, and in the case of Upper Volta, the Marxist revolutionary Thomas Sankara is who it bred. He came to power in 1983 and immediately got to work. He fought against gender discrimination by ending forced marriages and female genital mutilation. He launched healthcare, literacy, and vaccination campaigns, land reform and nationalization programs. He focused on infrastructure, combated desertification by planting millions of trees, dramatically lowered the infant mortality rate, and he fought effectively against hunger. So effectively that Jean Ziegler of the UN declared, Thomas Sankara has conquered hunger. Burkina Faso, in 4 years, has become food self-sufficient. This is notable considering Burkina Faso's history with famines and food scarcity. Sankara also refused to play ball with the IMF, an institution that has a history of predatory lending practices known to worsen conditions of already poor countries and open up their economies for Western exploitation. All of this is not to say that Sankara never made mistakes or that he was some kind of god amongst men. He himself would hate that description, as he openly criticized personality cults and he didn't allow for statues to be built in his image, but he absolutely sacrificed all he could for the people of his country. He even refused to take a presidential salary because his priority was helping the citizenry above all else. This completely contradicts the stereotypical socialist fat cat who lives in luxury while his people starve, the kind of Western caricature that we've been programmed to believe. Sankara, like Allende, shouldn't really be touched on as a footnote and deserves his own full video, but for the sake of brevity, he too was eventually overthrown in a coup, and Burkina Faso immediately began to regress in his absence.
Well, see, the thing is, like, somebody like Ethan Klein would just say it's because they are racially inferior. Like, Africans don't know how to govern themselves. Like, you know, that's what, you know, it's the same way they react to something like people say we should have a one-state solution in Palestine, right? Where Israelis and Palestinians live side by side as equals. Somebody like Ethan Klein would just say, well, then that would be a genocide of all the Israeli Jews. You can't trust. You need the walls to go up. That's the only thing that makes us safe. So it is like they don't, again, they don't give a shit about these arguments. Yeah, the West is trying to overthrow him right now.
Bolivia,
Yeah, exactly.
like other Latin American countries, still feels the burdens of colonialism even to this day. The way the land and resources are divided up in many of these countries largely continues colonial landholding practices where a small group of white elites, descendants of European colonizers, hold the majority of the land while indigenous populations live in poverty. In addition to land and resources being controlled by a small ruling elite, they are also bought up and hoarded by foreign corporations, further exacerbating inequality. These conditions gave rise to many leftist Latin American movements that aimed to reclaim their land and resources from foreign influence, kick out the Western imperialists, and use their country's natural wealth to serve the vast majority of their populations, not just a small ruling class. In addition to all this, in the 80s and 90s, Bolivia was subjected to neoliberal policies as a result of them taking on World Bank and IMF loans. I've touched on this phenomenon earlier in this video, but the IMF, World Bank, and other international financial institutions push developing countries to take out predatory loans. The goal is to entrap these countries in debt. Once they're in debt, the IMF or the World Bank forces them to abide by specific loan conditionalities and adopt policies that serve to enrich Western capitalist interests at the expense of the poor, indebted nation. I have a whole video on this topic if you want to learn more. In the case of Bolivia, they were subjected to intense privatizations where Western interests bought up their shit and benefited from the wealth generated by it. The World Bank even forced Bolivia to privatize the goddamn water supply and sell it off to a consortium led by Bechtel, a U.S. corporation. This led to an increase in the price of water that many families couldn't afford, and since the private sector tends to follow profit and not human well-being, poorer areas were subjected to poor quality services. To quote Frederick Gordon's Freshwater Resources and Interstate Cooperation, the privatization of Bolivia's water supply eliminated any guarantee of water distribution to rural areas. This resulted in only half of Cochabamba's population being connected to the central water system. The law also prohibited the peasants from constructing collection tanks to gather rainwater. Law 2029 required people to ask the water superintendent for permission to collect rainwater. These goddamn capitalists think they own the fucking clouds. In addition to water, oil and other natural resources were also privatized and therefore could not be efficiently used to serve serve the Bolivian population. Something needed to change. This led to the rise of a man named Evo Morales and his movement towards socialism, or MAS, party. Morales assumed the presidency in 2006, and he was the first indigenous president of the country. This was a big deal considering Bolivia's history with racism. His ascension to the presidency reflected the end of a particular Andean form of apartheid that had marginalized the majority indigenous population since the Spanish conquest, as author Benjamin Cole put it. Morales quickly got to work writing a new Bolivian constitution that served everyone, not just the ruling class. In compliance with socialist principles of participatory democracy, he called on the indigenous population to help draft the constitution. As Arnold August said, people writing their own constitution and ratifying it in a popular referendum is one of the hallmarks of a democracy. Prior to Morales' presidency, foreign corporations had significant control over Bolivia's oil and gas, extracting hefty profits while the country didn't get to benefit from its own natural wealth. Morales changed this. He brought the hydrocarbon sector under state control and renegotiated contracts with the foreign companies, forcing them into positions where they had to strike a deal that would serve the Bolivian people or get kicked out of the country completely. This allowed for Morales to use Bolivian oil revenues to fund social programs, development, and improve the lives of the many, all while remaining firm in his critique of neoliberalism and his desire to shift towards socialism. He redistributed about 130 million acres of land from state or private ownership to indigenous families, many of whom had historically been forced into sharecropping or slavery. He grew the country's GDP by about 4.8% a year, halved the amount of people living in extreme poverty, leading to the World Bank changing Bolivia's classification from low income to lower middle income. He funded schools, hospitals, and infrastructure programs with the funds generated by the hydrocarbon sector that was now actually serving the people and not just the rich, raised the minimum wage, and much, much more. By 2012, Morales helped 1 million Bolivians escape poverty. Unfortunately,
about that accident, they didn't release it. There was an accident. It wasn't like they were like, haha, we're gonna poison this river. There was a major accident, which, you know, happens. The reality is, how is there a response to an accident? How do they change what they did to make it, to restore what was done, can be restored, to clean up the mess and ensure that such an accident doesn't happen again?
Like the many other instances of democratically elected socialist governments, Morales' story doesn't have a happy ending. U.S. intervention paired with...
By the way, he was extremely successful. Bolivia it was the fastest growing economy in Latin America. I don't know if he mentioned that. Hold on, let me back it up. I missed it. I was looking at something else.
That had marginalized the majority indigenous population since the Spanish conquest, as author Benjamin Cole put it. Morales quickly got to work writing a new Bolivian constitution that served everyone, not just the ruling class. In compliance with socialist principles of participatory democracy, he called on the indigenous population to help draft the constitution. As Arnold August said, people writing their own constitution and ratifying it in a popular referendum is one of the hallmarks of a democracy. Prior to Morales' presidency, foreign corporations had significant control over Bolivia's oil and gas, extracting hefty profits while the country didn't get to benefit from its own natural wealth. Morales changed this. He brought the hydrocarbon sector under state control and renegotiated contracts with the foreign companies, forcing them into positions where they had to strike a deal that would serve the Bolivian people or get kicked out of the country completely. This allowed for Morales to use Bolivian oil revenues to fund social programs, development, and improve the lives of the many, all while remaining firm in his critique of neoliberalism and his desire to shift towards socialism. He redistributed about 130 million acres of land from state or private ownership to indigenous families, many of whom had historically been forced into sharecropping or slavery. He grew the country's GDP by about 4.8% a year, halved the amount of people living in extreme poverty, leading to the World Bank changing Bolivia's classification from low income to lower middle income. He funded schools, hospitals, and infrastructure programs with the funds generated by the hydrocarbon sector that was now actually serving the people and not just the rich, raised the minimum wage, and much, much more. By 2012, Morales helped 1 million Bolivians escape poverty. Unfortunately, like the many other instances of democratically elected socialist governments, Morales' story doesn't have a happy ending. U.S. intervention paired with a growing right-wing movement in Bolivia made for hard times to come. As Morales was running again for his fourth term...
China could do no wrongs, though. No, when an accident, an environmental and industrial accident occurs, there's a difference between an accident and an intentional release. And accidents happen with industrial processes. The question is, how is their response? Is there a regulatory response? Is there cleanup? Is there compensation? That's just part of an industrial society. You're going to have accidents. They happen all the time. In every country that has an industry, accidents happen. Now, how is that responded to is what tells you the nature of the institutions.
Term, which in my opinion he shouldn't have done. It would have made more sense to pass the reins off to a younger Moss member. The election results stopped updating. Once they resumed updating, Morales' lead had grown as rural votes were counted. This caused his opposition to accuse him of fraud, and the Organization of American States claimed that the election showed signs of irregularities. However, later independent studies, including by the Center for Economic and Policy Research, found no statistical evidence of fraud, and multiple experts accused the OAS of using flawed methodology and dishonesty. The OAS then went on to request that Morales redo the election, and he agreed, saying it was no problem. But before the election took place, the conservative military forced him to step down and flee the country. Make no mistake, this was a military coup. He was replaced by Janine Áñez, who assumed power unconstitutionally. Áñez was a deranged right-winger who went on to massacre Morales'
Not
support.
only that, she was literally like the most far-right party that had like no support, but yet the United States stood behind her as the leader.
In the aftermath of his overthrow, leading Bolivia to charge her with genocide. So again, I guess there was a bit of a disaster that took place here, but it wasn't socialism, it was getting rid of socialism. Aside from the projects mentioned so far in this video, it is worth highlighting a few other socialist projects whose achievements seem to get swept under the rug. From the success of Slovenia, which came from very humble beginnings only to become a wealthy nation while maintaining its unique market socialist model, to the Indian state of Kerala, which of course is still forced to work within the confines of the Indian constitution, but nonetheless has done their best to build a democratic socialist project that ushered the state into an era of high human development, a thriving worker cooperative sector, near universal literacy, an increased lifespan, one of the lowest mortality rates in India, and an overall improvement in the quality of life. We begin to see that it's unfair to brush off socialism as an ideology that only ever leads to misery. It erases the stories of the millions of people whose lives were improved because of it. Alright, well, it would be nice for Mr. H3 to stumble across this video.
He doesn't give a shit,
and
man.
If he has any
doesn't care. He's a wealthy fucking millionaire Zionist from Beverly Hills. But the video is good. I like this guy. This guy has a really cool voice as well. All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for hanging out with me today.